Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman, dated 1869. Life of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, known at various times and in various places by very many different names, such as Moses, in allusion to her being the leader and guide to so many people in their exodus from the land of bondage, the conductor of the Underground Railroad, and Molly Pitcher, for energy and daring by which she delivered a fugitive slave who was about to be dragged back to the South, was for the first 25 years of her life a slave on the eastern shore of Maryland. Her own master she represents as never unnecessarily cruel, but as was common amongst slaveholders, he often hired out his slaves to others, some of whom proved to be tyrannical and brutal to the utmost limit of their power. She had worked only as a field hand for many years, following the oxen, loading and unloading wood, and carrying heavy burdens, by which she, naturally remarkable power of muscle, was developed, that her feat of strength often called forth the wonder of strong laboring men. Thus was she prepared for the life of hardship and endurance which lay before her, for the deeds of daring she was to do, and of which her ignorant and darkened mind at that time never dreamed. The first person by whom she was hired was a woman who, though married and the mother of a family, was still Miss Susan to her slaves, as is customary at the South. This woman was possessed of the good things of this life, and provided liberally for her slaves as far as food and clothing went. But she had been brought up to believe and to act upon that belief, that a slave could be taught to do nothing, and would do nothing, but under the sting of the whip. Harriet, then a young girl, was taken from her life in the field, and having never seen the inside of a house better than a cabin in the negro quarters, was put to housework without being told how to do anything. The first thing was to put a parlor in order, move these chairs and tables in the middle of the room, sweep the carpet clean, then dust everything and put them back in their places. These were the directions given, and Harriet was left alone to do her work. The whip was in sight on the mantelpiece, as a reminder of what was to be expected if the work was not done well. Harriet fixed the furniture as she was told to do, swept with all her strength, raising a tremendous dust. The moment she had finished sweeping, she took her dusting cloth and wiped everything so you could see her face in them, she had shown so. In haste to go and set the table for breakfast and do her other work, the dust which she had set flying only settled down again on chairs, tables, and the piano. Miss Susan came in and looked around. Then came the call for Minty. Harriet's name was Araminta, Araminta, at the South. She drew her up to the table, saying, "What do you mean by doing my work this way, you?" And passing her finger on the table and piano, she showed her the mark it made to the dust. "Miss Susan, I done swept and dust just as you told me." But the whip was already taken down, and the strokes were falling on my head and face and neck. 4 times this scene was repeated before breakfast, when, during the 5th whipping, the door opened and Miss Emily came in. She was a married sister of Miss Susan, and was making her visit, and though brought up with the same associations as her sister, seems to have been a person of more gentle and reasonable nature. Not being able to endure the screams of a child any longer, she came in, took her sister by the arm, and said, "If you do not stop whipping that child, it will leave your house and never come back." Miss Susan declared that she would not mind, and she cited her work on purpose. Miss Emily said, "Leave her to me a few moments," and Miss Susan left the room indignant. As soon as they were gone alone, Miss Emily said, "Now, Minty, show me how you do your work." For the 6th time, Harriet moved all the furniture in the middle of the room. Then she swept, and the moment she was done sweeping, she took the dusting cloths to wipe off the furniture. "Now stop there," said Miss Emily. "Go away now and do some of your other work, and when it is time to dust, I will call you." When the time came, she called her and explained to her how the dust had now settled, and that if she wiped it off now, the furniture would remain bright and clean. These few words, an hour or two before, would have saved Harriet her whipping for that day, as they probably did for many a day after. Well, with this woman, after working from early morning till late at night, she was obliged to sit up all night to rock a cross, sick child. Her mistress laid upon her bed with a whip under her pillow and slept. But if the tired nurse forgot herself for a moment, if her weary head dropped and her hands ceased to rock the cradle, the child would cry out, and then down would come the whip upon the neck and face of the poor weary creature. The scars are still plainly visible, where the whip cut into the flesh. Perhaps her mistress was preparing her, though she did not know it then, by this enforced habit of wakefulness, for the many long nights of travel when she was the leader and guide of the weary and hunted ones who were escaping from bondage. Miss Susan got tired of Harriet, as Harriet was determined she should do, and so abandoned her intention of buying her and sent her back to her master. She was next hired out to a man who inflicted upon her the lifelong injury from which she is suffering now, by breaking her skull with the weight from the scales. The injury thus inflicted causes her often to fall into a state of somnolency, from which it is almost impossible to rouse her. Disabled and sick, her flesh all wasted away, she was returned to her owner. He tried to sell her, but no one would buy her. Day after day wouldn't give me sixpence for me, she said. And so, she said, from Christmas till March I worked as I could, and I prayed through all the long nights. I groaned and prayed for old Master. O Lord, convert Master. O Lord, convert that man's heart. "'Pears like I prayed all them times," said Harriet. "'Bout my work everywhere. I prayed and I groaned to the Lord. When I went to the horse trough to wash my face, I took up the water into my hands, and I said, O Lord, wash me, make me clean. Then I take up something to wipe my face, and say, O Lord, wipe away all my sin. And when I took the broom and began to sweep, I groaned, O Lord, whatsoever sin there be in my heart, sweep it out, Lord, clear and clean." No words can describe the pathos of her tones as she broke out into these words of prayer after the manner of her people. "And so," she said, "I prayed all night long for Master till the 1st of March, and all the time he was bringing people to look at me and trying to sell me. Then we heard that some of us was going to be sold to go win the chain gang down to the cotton and rice fields, and they said I was going on my brothers as sister. Then I changed my prayers. 1st of March I began to pray, O Lord, if you ain't never going to change that man's heart, kill him, Lord, and take him out of that way. Next thing I heard, old Master was dead, and he died just as he lived. Oh, then it appeared like I gave all the world full of gold if I had it to bring that poor soul back, but I couldn't pray for him no longer. The slaves were told that their master's will provided that none of them should be sold out of the state. That satisfied most of them, and they were very happy. But Harriet was not satisfied. She never closed her eyes, that she did not imagine she saw the horsemen coming, and heard the screams of women and children as they were being dragged away to a far worse slavery than they were enduring here. Harriet was married at that time to a free Negro, who not only did not trouble himself about her fears, but did his best to betray her and bring her back after she escaped. She would start at night with the cry, "Oh, they're coming, I must go." Her husband called her a fool and said she was like old Cujo, who, when a joke went round, never laughed till half hour after everybody else got through. And so just as all the danger was past, she began to be frightened. But still Harriet in her fancy saw the horsemen coming and heard the screams of terrified women and children. And all that time in my dreams and visions, she said, I seemed to see a line, and on the other side of that line were green fields and lovely grasses and flowers and beautiful white ladies who stretched out their arms to me over the line, but I couldn't reach them nohow. I always fell before I got to the line. On Saturday it was whispered in the quarters that 2 of Harriet's sisters had been sent off with a chain gang. That morning she started, having persuaded 3 of her brothers to accompany her. But they had not gone far when the brothers, appalled by the dangers before and behind them, determined to go back, and in spite of her remonstrances, dragged her with them. In fear and terror she remained over Sunday, and on Monday night a Negro from another part of the plantation came privately to tell Harriet that herself and brothers were to be carried off that night. The poor old mother, who belonged to the same mistress, was just going to milk. Harriet wanted to get away without letting her know. because she knew that she would raise an uproar and prevent her going, or insist upon going with her, and the time for this was not yet. But she must give some intimation to those she was going to leave on her intentions, and said a farewell as she might to friends and relations on the plantation. These communications were generally made by singing. They sang as they walked along the country roads, and the chorus was taken up by others, and the uninitiated knew not the hidden meaning of the words. Where the old chariot comes, I gwine to leave you. I bound to the promised land, I gwine to leave you. These words meant something more than a journey to the heavenly Canaan. Harriet said, "Here, mother, go along. I do the milking tonight and bring it in." The old woman went to her cabin. Harriet took down her sunbonnet and went on to the big house where some of her relatives lived as house servants. She thought she could trust Mary, but there were others in the kitchen, and she could not say anything. Mary began to frolic with her. She threw her across the kitchen and ran out, knowing that Mary would follow her. But just as they turned the corner of the house, the master to whom Harriet was now hired came riding up on his horse. Mary darted back, and Harriet thought there was no way now but to sing. But the doctor, as the master was called, was regarded with special awe by his slaves. If they were singing or talking together in the field or on the road, and the doctor appeared, all was hushed till he passed. But Harry had no time for ceremony. Her friends must have a warning, and whether the doctor thought her impertinent or not, she must sing him farewell. So on she went to meet him, singing, "I'm sorry I'm going to leave you. Farewell, oh farewell. But I'll meet you in the morning. Farewell, oh farewell." The doctor passed, and she bowed as she went on singing still. "I'll meet you in the morning. I'm bound to the promised land. On the other side of Jordan, bound to the promised land." She reached the gate and looked around. The doctor had stopped his horse and had turned around in the saddle, was looking at her as if there might be more in this than met the ear. Harriet closed the gate, went on a little way, came back. The doctor was still gazing at her. She lifted up the gate as if she had not latched it properly, waved her hand to him, and burst it out again. "I'll meet you in the morning, safe to the promised land, on the other side in Jordan, bound for the promised land." And as she started on her journey, not knowing whither she went, except that she was going to follow the North Star till it led her to liberty. Cautiously and by night she traveled, cunningly feeling her way, and finding out who were friends, till, after a long and painful journey, she found, in answer to careful inquiries, that she had at last crossed that magic line, which then separated the land of bondage from the land of freedom. For this was before we were commanded by law to take part in the inquiry of slavery, in aid in taking and sending back those poor haunted fugitives who had manhood and intelligence enough to enable them to make their way thus far towards freedom. When I found I had crossed this line, she said, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. But then came the bitter dew in the cup of joy. She said she felt like a man who was put in the state prison for 25 years. All these 25 years he was thinking of his home and longing for the time he would see it again. At last the day comes. He leaves the prison gates. He makes his way to his old home, but his old home is not there. The house has been pulled down, and a new one has been put up in its place. His family and friends are gone, nobody knows where. There is no one to take him by the hand, no one to welcome him. So it was with me, she said. I had crossed the line. I was free. But there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home, after all, was down in Maryland, because my father, my mother, my brothers and sisters and friends were there. But I was free, and they should be free. I would make a home in the north and bring them there, God helping me. Oh, how I prayed then, she said. I said to the Lord, I'm going to hold steady unto you, and I know you'll see me through. She came to Philadelphia and worked in hotels and clubhouses, and afterwards at Cape May. Whenever she had raised enough money to pay expenses, she would make her way, hide herself in various ways, give notice to those who were ready to strike for freedom. When her party was made up, then she would start always on Saturday night, because advertisements would not be sent out on Sunday, which gave them one day in advance. Then the pursuers would start after them. Advertisements would be posted everywhere. There was one reward for $12,000 offered for the head of the woman who was constantly appearing and enticing away parties of slaves from their masters. She had traveled in the cars when these posters were put up over her head, and she heard them read by those about her, for she could not read herself. Fearlessly she went on, trusting in the Lord. She said, I started with this idea in my head. There's two things I got a right to, and these two are death or liberty. One or the other I mean to have. No one will take me back alive. I shall fight for my liberty, and when the time has come for me to go, the Lord will let them kill me. And acting upon this simple creed and firm in this trusting faith, she went back and forth 19 times, according to the reckoning of her friends. She remembers that she went 11 times from Canada, but on the other journeys she kept no reckonings. While Harriet was working as a cook in one of the large hotels of Philadelphia, the play of Uncle Tom's Cabin was being performed for many weeks every night. Some of her fellow servants wanted her to go and see it. No, said Harriet, I ain't got no heart to go and see the sufferings of my people played on the stage. I heard Uncle Tom's Cabin read, and I tell you Miss Stowe's pen hasn't begun to paint what slavery is, as I have seen it in the far South. I've seen the real thing, and I don't want to see it on a stage or in no theater. I will give here an article from a paper published nearly a year ago, which mentioned the price set upon the head of Harriet was much higher than I have stated it to be. When asked about this, Harriet said she did not know whether it was so, but she heard them read from the paper that the reward was $12,000. Among American women, says the article referred to, who has shown a courage and self-devotion to the welfare of others equal to Harriet Tubman, hear her story and going down again and again into the very jaws of slavery to rescue her suffering people, bring them all through perils and dangers enough to appall the stoutest heart, till she was known among them as Moses. $40,000 was not too great a reward for the Maryland slaveholders to offer for her. Think of her brave spirit, as strong as Daniel's of old, in its fearless purpose to serve God, even through the fierce furnace she should be her portion. I have looked into her dark face, and I wondered and admired as I listened to the thrilling deeds her lion heart had prompted her to dare. I have heard their groans and sighs and seen their tears, and I would give every drop of blood in my veins to free them, she said. The other day at Gerrit's, Gerrit Smith's, I saw this heroic woman, whom the pen of genius will yet make famous as one of the noblest Christians' hearts ever inspired to lift the burdens of the wronged and oppressed. And what do you think she said to me? She had been tending and caring for our Union black and white soldiers in hospital during the war, and at the end of her labors was on her way home, coming in a car through New Jersey. A white man, the conductor, thrust her out of the car with such violency that she was not able to work scarcely any sense. And she told me of the pain she had and still suffered. She said she did not know what she should have done for herself, and the old father and mother she takes care of, Mr. Whiddell Phillips, had not sent her $60 that kept her warm through the winter. She had a letter from W.H. Seward to Major General Hunter, in which she says, I have known her long, and a nobler and higher spirit, a truer, seldom dwells in the human form. It will be impossible to give any connected account of the different journeys taken by Harriet for the rescue of her people, as she herself has no idea of the dates commenced with them or of the order in which they were made. She thinks she was about 25 when she made her first own escape, and this was in the last year of James K. Polk's administration. From that time to the beginning of the war, her years were spent in these journeys back and forth, with intervals between, in which she worked only to spend the avails of her labor in providing for the wants of her next party of fugitives. By night she traveled many times on foot, over mountains, through forests, across rivers, mid perils by land, perils by waters, perils by enemies, perils among false brethren. Sometimes members of her own party would become exhausted, forcertain, footsore, and bleeding, declare they could not go on. They must stay where they dropped down and die. Others would think a voluntary return to slavery better than being overtaken and carried back, and would insist upon returning. Then there would be no remedy but force. The revolver carried by this bold and daring pioneer would be pointed at their heads. "Dead niggers tell no tales," said Harriet. "Go on or die." And so she compelled them to drag their weary limbs on their northward journey. At one time she collected and sent on a gang of 39 fugitives in the care of others, as from some cause she was prevented from accompanying them. Sometimes when she and her party were concealed in the woods, they saw their pursuers pass on their horses down the high road, taking up advertisements for them on their fences and trees. "And how we laughed," she said. "We was the fools and they was the wise men, but we wasn't fools enough to go down them high roads in broad daylight." At one time she left her party in the woods and went by a long and roundabout way to one of the stations of the Underground Railroad, as she called them. Here she procured food for her famished party, often paying out of her own hardly gained earnings $5 a day for food for them, but she dared not go back to them till night, for fear of being watched and thus revealing their hiding place. After nightfall, the sound of a hymn sung in the distance came upon the ears of the concealed and famished fugitives in the woods, and they know that their deliverer is at hand. They listen eagerly for the words she sings, for by them they are to be warned of danger or informed of safety. Nearer and nearer comes the unseen singer, and the words are wafted to their ears. "Hail, O hail, O happy spirits, death no more shall make you fear. No grief, nor sorrow, pain, nor anguish shall no more distress you there. Around him are 10,000 angels, already ready to obey command. They are always hoarding round him till you reach the heaven land. Jesus will go with you. He will lead you to his throne. He who died has gone before you, trod the winepress all alone. He whose thunder shakes creation, he who bids the planets roll, he who rides upon the temple, tempest and his scepter sway, behold. Dark and thorny is the desert, through the pilgrim makes his way, yet beyond this vale of sorrow lies the fields of endless days." I gave you these words exactly as Harriet sang them to me, to a sweet and simple Methodist air. The first time I go by singing these hymns, they don't come out to me, she said, till I listened if the coast is clear. When I went back and sang it again, they came out. But if I sang, "Moses, go back down to Egypt, 'tis O Pharaoh, let me go," hadn't been for Adam's fall, should have to die at all. Then they don't come out, for there's danger in the ways. And so by night, travel, by hiding, by signals, by threatenings, she brought the people safely to the land of liberty. But after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, she said, "I wouldn't trust Uncle Sam with my people no longer." I brought 'em all clear off to Canada. Of the very many interesting stories told me by Harriet, I cannot refrain from telling of my readings of that of Joe, who accompanied her upon her 7th or 8th journey from Maryland to Canada. Joe was a noble specimen of a Negro, and it was hired out by his master to a man for whom he worked faithfully for 6 years, saving him the expense of an overseer, and taking all troubles off his hands. At length this man found him so absolutely necessary to him that he determined to buy him at any cost. His master held him proportionally high. However, by paying $1,000 down for him and promising to pay another 1,000 in a certain time, Joe passed into the hands of the new master. As may be imagined, Joe was somewhat surprised when the first order issued from the master's lips was, "Now, Joe, strip and take a whipping." Joe's experience of whippings, as he had seen them inflicted upon others, was not such as to cause him particularly desire to go through the same operation on his own account, and he naturally enough demurred and at first thought of resisting. But he called to mind a scene which he had witnessed a few days before in the field, the particulars of which are too terrible and too harassing to the feeling to be given to my readers. He thought it best to submit, but first he tried remonstration. "Master," he said, "hadn't I always been faithful to you? Hadn't I worked through sun and rain, early in the morning and late at night? Hadn't I saved you an overseer by doing his work? Have you anything to complain of me again?" "No, Joe, I've no complaint to make of you. You're a good nigger, and you've always worked well. But the first lesson my niggers have to learn is that I am the master, and that they are not to resist or refuse to obey anything I tell them to do. So the first thing they've got to do is to be whipped. If they resist, they get it all the harder, and so I'll go on till I kill them. But they've got to give up at last and learn that I'm master. Joe thought it best to submit. He stripped off his upper clothing and took his whipping without a word. But as he threw his clothes up over his torn, bleeding back, he said, "'Tis the last." That night he took a boat and went a long distance to the cabin of Harriet's father and said, "Next time Moses come, let me know." It was only a week or two after that the mysterious woman whom no one could lay the finger on appeared, and men and women and children began to disappear from the plantation. One fine morning Joe was missing, and his brother William from another plantation. Peter and Eliza too were gone, and these made part of Harriet's next party, who began their pilgrimage from Maryland to Canada, or as they expressed it, from Egypt to the land of Canaan. Their adventures were enough to fill a volume. They were pursued. They were hidden in potato holes, while their pursuers passed within a few feet of them. They were passed along by friends in various disguises. They scattered and separated, to be led by guides in a roundabout way to a meeting place again. They were taken in by Sam Green, a man who was afterwards sent to state prison for 10 years for having a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin in his house. And so, haunted and hiding and wondering, they came at last to the long bridge at the entrance of the city of Williamston, Delaware. The rewards posted up everywhere had been, at first, $500 for Joe, if taken within the limits of the United States, then $1,000, then $1,500, and all expenses clear and clean for his body in Easton jail. $800 for William and $400 for Peter, $1,200 for the woman who enticed them away. The long Williamston Bridge was guarded by police officers, and the advertisements were everywhere. The party was scattered and taken to houses of different colored friends, and word was sent secretly to Tom Garrett of Williamton of their condition and the necessity of their being taken across the bridge. Tom Garrett is a quarterman and a man of a wonderfully large and generous heart, through whose hands, Harriet tells me, 2,000 self-emancipated slaves passed on their way to freedom. He was always ready in heart and hand and means in aiding these poor fugitives, and rendered most efficient help to Harriet on her many of her journeys back and forth. A letter received a few days since by the writer from this noble-hearted philanthropist will be given presently. As soon as Tom Garrett heard of the condition of these poor people, his plan was formed. He engaged 2 wagons, filled them with bricklayers, whom, of course, he paid well for their share in the enterprise, and sent them across the bridge. They went as if on a frolic, singing and shouting. The guards saw them pass, and of course expected them to recross the bridge. After nightfall, and fortunately it was a dark night, the same wagons went back, but with an addition to their party. The fugitives were on the bottom of the wagons, and the bricklayers on the seats, still singing and shouting, and so they passed by the guards, who were entirely unsuspicious of the nature of the load the wagon contained, or of the amount of property thus escaping their hands, and so they made their way to New York. When they entered the anti-slavery office there, Joe was recognized at once by the description in the advertisement. "Well," said Mr. Oliver Johnson, "I am glad to see the man whose head is worth $1,500. At this, Joe's heart sank. If the advertisement had gone to New York, that place which it had taken them so many days and nights to reach, he thought he was still in danger. "And how far is it now to Canada?" he asked. When told how many miles, for they were to come through New York State and cross the suspension bridge, he was ready to give up. From that time Joe was silent, said Harriet. He sang no more, he talked no more. He sat with his head in his hand, and nobody could amuse him or make him take any interest in anything. They passed along in safety, and at length found themselves in the cars approaching the suspension bridge. The rest were very joyous and happy, but Joe sat silent and sad. Their fellow prisoners all seemed interested in and for them, and listened with tears as Harriet and all their party lifted up their voices and sang, "I'm on my way to Canada, that cold and dreary land. The sad effects of slavery I can no longer stand. I've served my master all my days, without a dime's reward, and now I'm forced to run away, to flee the lash abroad. Farewell, O master, don't think hard of me. I'll travel on to Canada, where all the slaves are free." The hounds are baying on my track, old master comes behind, resolved that he will bring me back before I cross the line. I'm now embarked for yonder shore, there a man's a man by law, the iron horse will bear me over, to shake the lion's paws. O righteous Father, wilt thou not pity me, and aid me on to Canada, where all the slaves are free? Oh, I heard Queen Victoria say, that if we would forsake our native land of slavery, and come across the lake, that she was standing on the shore, while arms extended wide, to give us all a peaceful home, beyond the rolling tide, farewell, O master, etc. The cars began to cross the bridge. Harriet was very anxious to have her companions see the falls. William, Peter, and Eliza came eagerly to look at the wonderful sight, but Joe sat still, with his head in his hand. Joe, come and look at the falls. Joe, you fool. You gotta look at these falls. It's your last chance. But Joe sat still and never raised his head. At length Harriet knew by the rise of the center of the bridge and the descent on the other side that he had crossed the line. She sprang across to Joe's seat, took him with all her might, and shouted, Joe, you've shook the lion's paws. Joe did not know what she meant. Joe, you're free, shouted Harriet. Then Joe's head went up. He raised his hands on high in his face, screaming with tears to heaven, and broke out in loud and thrilling tones. Glory to God and Jesus too. One more soul is safe. Oh, go and carry the news. One more soul got safe. Joe, come and look at the falls, cried Harriet. Glory to God and Jesus too. One more soul got safe was all the answer. The car stopped at the other side. Joe's feet were the first to touch British soil after those of the conductors. Loud roared the waters of Niagara, but louder still ascended the anthem of praise from the overflowing heart of the free man. And can we doubt that the strain was taken up by angel voices, and that through the arches of heaven echoed and re-echoed the strain? Glory to God in the highest, glory to God and Jesus too. One more soul is safe. The ladies and gentlemen gathered round him, and Harriet said, till I can't see Joe for the crowd, only I heard, glory to God and Jesus too, louder than ever. William went after him and pulled him, saying, Joe, stop your noise, you act like a fool. Then Peter ran in and jerked his Mose off his feet. Joe, stop your howling. Folks will think you're crazy. But Joe gave no heed. The ladies were crying, and tears like rain ran down Joe's stable cheeks. A lady reached over her fine handkerchief to him. Joe wiped his face, and then he spoke. Oh, if I felt like this to the south, it would have taken 9 men to take me. Only one more journey for me now, and that is to heaven. Well, you old fool, you, said Harriet, with whom there seems but one step from the sublime to the ridiculous. You might, looking at the falls first, and then gone to heaven afterwards. She has seen Joe several times since, a happy and industrious free man in Canada, and when asked, she often how it was possible that she was not afraid to go back with that tremendous price upon her head. Harriet always answered, Why, don't I think you, missus? It wasn't me, 'twas the Lord. I always told him I trust to you. I don't know where to go or what to do, but I expect you to lead me, and he always did. At one time she was going down, watched for everywhere, after there had been a meeting of slaveholders in the courthouse of one of the largest cities in Maryland, and an added reward had been put upon her head, with various threats of different cruel devices by which she would be tortured and put to death. Friends gathered round her, imploring her not to go on directly in the face of danger and death. This was Harriet's answer to them. Now, look ye, John saw the city, didn't he? Yes, John saw the city. Well, what did he see? He saw 12 gates. 3 of these gates was on the north, 3 of them on the east, 3 of them on the west, and there was 3 of them on the south too. And I reckon if they kill me down here, I'll get into one of them gates, don't you? Whether Harriet's idea of geographical bearing of the gates of the celestial city as seen in the apostolic vision were correct or not, we cannot doubt that she was right in the deduction her faith drew from them, and that somewhere, whether north, south, east, or west, to our dim vision, there is a gate to be opened for Harriet, where the welcome will be given. Come in, thou blessed of my Father. Many of the stories told by Harriet in answer to questions have been collaborated by letters, some of you, which will appear in this book. Leaving off on page 37. Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman, Part 2, picking up on page 37. Of others I have not been able to procure confirmation owing to ignorancy of the address of those conversant with the facts. I find among her papers, many of which are defaced by being carried about with her for years, portions of letters addressed to myself by persons at the South and speaking of the valuable assistance Harriet was rendering our soldiers in the hospital and our armies in the field. At this time, her manner of life, as related by herself, was this: "Well, missus, I go to D hospital. I would early rebring a morning. I get a big chunk of ice, I would, and bring it into basin and fill it with water. Then I take a sponge and begin. Fuss a man I come to, I thrust away the flies and the rise, the wood like bees round the hive. Then I began to bathe the wounds, and by the time I bathed off 3 or 4, the fire and heat would have melted the ice and make the water warm, and it would be as red as clear blood. Then I'd go get more ice. I would, by the time I got to the next ones, the flies would be round about, fussing, one black and thick as ember. In this way she worked day after day, till late at night. Then she went home to her little cabin and made about 50 pies, a great quantity of gingerbread, and 2 casks of root beer. These she would hire some contraband to sell for her through the camps, and thus she would provide her support for another day. For this woman never received pay or pension, and never drew for herself but 20 days' rations during the 4 years of her labors. At one time she was called away from Hilton Head by one of our officers to come to Fernandina, where men were dying off like sheep from dysentery. Harriet acquired quite a reputation for her skill in curing this disease, by a medicine which she prepared from roots, which grew near the waters which gave the disease. Here she found thousands of sick soldiers and contrabands, and immediately gave up her time and attention to them. At another time we find her nursing those who were down by hundreds with smallpox and malignant fevers. She had never had these diseases, but she seems to have no more fear of death in one form than another. The Lord would take care of her till her time came, and then she was ready to go. When our armies and gunboats first appeared in any part of the South, many of the poor Negroes were as much afraid of the Yankee Barbaric as of their own masters. It was almost impossible to win over their confidence or to get information from them. But to Harriet they would tell anything, and so it became quite important that she should accompany expeditions going up the rivers or into unexplored parts of the country, to control and get information from those whom they took with them as guides. General Hunter asked her at one time if she would go with several gunboats up the Combahee River, the object of the expedition being to take up the torpedoes placed by the rebels in the river to destroy railroads and bridges and to cut off supplies from the rebel troops. She said she would go if Colonel Montgomery was to be appointed commander of the expedition. Colonel Montgomery was one of John Brown's men and was well known to Harriet. Accordingly, Colonel Montgomery was appointed to the command, and Harriet with several men under her, the principal of whom was J. Plowden, whose pass I have, accompanied the expedition. Harriet describes in the most graphic manner the appearance of the plantations as they passed up the river, the frightened Negroes leaving their work and taking to the woods at the sight of the gunboats, then coming to peer out like startled deer, and scuttling away like the wind at the sound of the steam whistle. "Well," said one old Negro, "Master said the Yankees have horns and tails, but I never believe it till now." But the word was passed along by the mysterious telegraphic communications existing among these simple people that these were Lincoln's gunboats come to set them free. In vain, then, the drivers used their whips in their efforts to hurry the poor creatures back to their quarters. They all turned and ran for the gunboats. They came down every road, across every field, just as they had left their work and their cabin, women with children clinging around their necks, hanging to their dresses, running behind, all making at full speed for Lincoln's gunboats. 800 poor wretches at one time crowded the banks, with their hands extended towards the deliverers, and they were all taken off upon the gunboats and carried down to Beaufort. "I never see such a sight," said Harriet. "We laughed and laughed and laughed. Here you'd see a woman with a pail on her head, rice smoking in it just as she'd taken it from the fire, young one hanging on behind, one hand round her forehead to hold on, together hang digging in the rice pot, eating wild with all its might, hold on her dress 2 or 3 more, down her back a bag with a pig in it. One woman brought 2 pigs, a white one and a black one. We took 'em on board, named the white pig Beauregard, and the black pig Jeff Davis. Sometimes the women would come with twins hanging round their necks, pairs like I never see so many twins in my life, bags on their shoulders, baskets on their heads, and young ones tagging behind, all loaded, pigs squealing, chickens screaming, young ones squalling. And so they came pouring down to the gunboats. When they stood on the shore and the small boats put out to take them off, they all wanted to get in at once. After the boats were crowded, they would hold on to them so that they could not leave the shore. The oarsmen would beat them on their hands, but they would not let go. They were afraid the gunboats would go off and leave them, and all wanted to make sure of one of these arks of refuge. At length Colonel Montgomery shouted from the upper deck above the clamor of appealing tones, "Moses, you'll have to get him a song." Then Harriet lifted up her voice and sang, "Of all the whole creatures in the east or in the west, the glorious Yankee nation is the greatest and the best. Come along, don't be alarmed. Uncle Sam is rich enough to give you all a farm." At the end of every verse, the Negroes in their enthusiasm would throw up their hands and shout glory, and the rowboats would take that opportunity to push off. And so at last they were all brought on board. The masters fled, houses and barns, railroad bridges were burned, tacks torn up, torpedoes destroyed, and the expedition was in all respects successful. This fearless woman was often sent into the rebel lines as a spy and brought back very valuable information as to the position of the armies and batteries. She has been in battle when the shot was falling like hail and the bodies of dead and wounded men were dropping around her like leaves in autumn. But the thought of fear never seems to have had a place for a moment in her mind. She had her duty to perform, and she expected to take care of it till it was done. Would that instead of taking them in this poor way at second hand, my readers could hear this woman's graphic accounts of scenes she herself witnessed, could listen to her imitations of Negro preachers in their own very peculiar dialect, her singing of camp-meeting hymns, her accounts of experienced meetings, her imitations of the dances and the funeral ceremonies of these simple people. Why, the language down dar is this far south is just as different from Miles of Maryland as you can think, she said. They laughed when they heard me talk and could not understand him nohow. She described a midnight funeral which she attended for the slaves never having been allowed to bury their dead in the daytime, continued the custom of night funerals from habit. The corpse was laid upon the ground, and the people all sat around, the group being lighted up by pine torches. The old Negro preacher began by giving out a hymn, which was sung by all. "And oh, I wish you could hear him sing, Missus," said Harriet. "Their voices so sweet, and they can sing everything we sing, and then they can sing a great many hymns that we can't never catch at all." The old preacher began his sermon by pointing to the dead man who lay on a rude box on the ground before him. "Shum, da-da-dee-dee-dum, shum, David, da-da-dee-dee-dum. Now I want you all to flee for a moment. Who'd this congregation is gwine next to lie, diddy-diddy-dum. You can't go nowheres, my friends and brethrens, they's deaf, and ill find you. You can't dig no hole so deep and bury yourself there, but God Almighty, Faustin, I shall find you, and death ill come etter you. You can't go into the big fort, pointing to Hilton Head, and shut yourself up there far dat Shish Buckner said de dilly couldn't take, they deaf'n find you there. All your friends may forget you, but deaf'n never gon' forget you. Now, my brethren, prepare to lie. Diddy-diddy-dum. This was the burden of the very long sermon, after which the whole congregation went round in a sort of solemn dance called the spiritual shuffle, shaking hands with each other and calling each other by name as they sung. My sister Mary bounced to go. My sister Nanny bounced to go. My brother Tony bouncing to go. My brother July bouncing to go. This is the same tune, till every hand had been shaken by every one of the company. When they came to Harriet, who was a stranger, they sang, "Everybody a-bouncin' to go." The body was then placed in a government wagon, and by the light of the pipe torches the strange dark procession moved along, singing a rude funeral hymn till they reached the place of burial. Harriet's account of her interview with an old Negro she met at Hilton Head is amusing and interesting. He said, "I been 73 years, working for my master without even a dime wages. I'd work rain wet, sun dry. I'd work with my mouth full of dust, but would not stop to get a drink of water. I've been whipped and starved, and I've always been praying, 'O Lord, come and deliver us.' All that time the birds had been flying, and the rabbits had been crying, and the fish had been swimming in these waters. One day I looked up, and I see a big cloud. It didn't come up like the clouds come up further yonder, but it appeared so right overhead. Deer was thunder out of that, and deer was lightnings. Then I looked round down in the waters, and I see appeared to me a big house in the water, and out of the big house came great big eggs, and the good eggs went on toward the air and fell into the fort, and then all the bad eggs burst before they got there. Then the Buckreek began to run, as the neighbors stopped running till they get to the swamps and stick there and died there. Then I heard the Yankee ships, the Washbash, firing out of the big eggs, and they had come to set us free. Then I prayed the Lord. He come and put the little finger in the work, and the Shashbakara all go, and the birds stop flying, and the rabbits start crying. And when I go to catch a fish to eat with my rice, there's no fish there. Dear Lord Almighty, come and frighten them all out of the waters. Praise the Lord. I've prayed 73 years, and now he's coming, and we be free. The last time Harriet was returning from the war with her pass as a hospital nurse, she brought a half-fare ticket, as she was told she must do, and missing the other train, she got into an immigrant train on the Amboy Railroad. When the conductor looked at her ticket and said, "Come, hustle out of here. We don't carry niggers for half-fare." Harriet explained to him that she was in employment of the government and was entitled to transportation as the soldiers were, but the conductor took her forcibly by the arm and said, "I'll make you tired of trying to stay here." She resisted, and being very strong, she could probably have got the better of the conductor had he not called 3 men to his assistance. The car was filled with immigrants, and no one seemed to take her part. The only words she heard, accompanied with fearful oaths, were, "Pitch the nigger out." They nearly wrenched her arm off, and at length threw her with all their strength into a baggage car. She supposed her arm was broken, but in intense suffering she came on to New York. As she left the car, a delicate-looking young man came up to her and handed her a card, saying, "You ought to sue the conductor, and if you want a witness, call on me." Harriet remained all winter under the care of a physician in New York. He advised her to sue the railroad company, and said that he would willingly testify as to her injuries. But the card the young man had given her was only a visiting card, and she did not know where to find him, so she let the matter go. The writer here finds it necessary to apologize for the very desultory and hasty manner in which this little book is written, being herself pressed for time in the expectation of soon leaving the country, she is obliged to pin down the material to be used in the short and uninterrupted intervals she can obtain from Harriet, and also to use such letters and accounts as may be sent her as they come, without being able to work them in the order of time. A very material assistance is to be rendered her by the kind offer of an account of Harriet's services during the war, written by Mr. Charles P. Wood of Auburn, and kindly copied by one of Harriet's most faithful and most efficient friends, Mrs. S. M. Hopkins of that place. It was a wise plan of our seduous heroine to leave her old parents till the last be brought away. They were pensioned off as too old to work, had a cabin and a horse and a cow, and were quite comfortable. If Harriet had taken them away before the young people, these last would have been sold into Southern slavery to keep them out of her way. But at length Harriet heard that the old man had been betrayed by a slave whom he had assisted, but who had turned back, and when questioned by his wife, told her the story of his intended escape, and of the aid he had received from old Ben. This woman, hoping to curry favor with her master, revealed the whole to him, and old Ben was arrested. He was to be tried the next week. Then Harriet appeared upon the scene, and, as she says, saved him expense the trial, and removed her father to a higher court by taking him off to Canada. The manner of their escape is detailed in the following letter by Thomas Garrett, the Wilmington Quaker. Wilmington, 6th month, 1868. My friend, thy favor of the 12th reached me yesterday, requesting some reminiscences as I could give respecting the remarkable labors of Harriet Tubman in aiding her colored friends from bondage. I may begin by saying, living as I have in this slave state, and the laws being very severe, where any proof could be made of anyone aiding slaves on the way to freedom, I have not felt at liberty to keep any written word of Harriet's or any labors, except in numbering those whom I have aided. For that reason I cannot furnish so interesting an account of Harriet's labors as I otherwise could, and now would be glad to do. For in truth I never met with any person of any color who had more confidence in the voice of God as spoken direct to her soul. She had frequently told me that she talked with God, and he talked with her every day of her life, and she has declared to me that she felt no more fear of being arrested by her former master or by any other person when in his immediate neighborhood than she did in the state of New York or Canada, for she said she never ventured only where God sent her, and her faith in his supreme power truly was great. I have now been confined to my room with indisposition more than 4 weeks, and cannot sit to write much, but I feel so much interested in Harriet that I must try to give some of the most remarkable instances that now present themselves to my mind. The date of the commencement of her labors I cannot certainly give, but I think it must have been about 1845. From that time till 1860, I think, she must have brought from the neighborhood where she had been held as a slave from 60 to 80 persons from Maryland, some 80 miles from here. No slave who placed himself under her care was ever arrested that I have heard of. She mostly had her regular stopping places on her route, but in one instance when she had 2 stout men with her, some 30 miles below here, she said that God told her to stop, which she did, and then asked him what she must do. He told her to leave the road and to turn left. She soon obeyed and came to a small stream of tide water. There was no boat, no bridge. She again inquired of her guide what she was to do. She was told to go through. It was cold in the month of March, but having confidence in her guide, she went in, and the water came up to her armpits. The men refused to follow till they saw her safe to the opposite shore. Then they followed, and if I mistake not, she had soon to wade a second stream, soon after which she came to a cabin of colored people, who took them all in, put them into bed, and dried their clothes, ready to proceed next morning on the journey. Harriet had run out of money and gave them some of her underclothing to pay for their kindnesses. When she called on me 2 days after, she was so hoarse she could hardly speak, and was also suffering from a violent toothache. The strange part of the story we found to be that the master of those two men had put up the previous day at the railroad station near where she left an advertisement for them offering a large reward for their apprehension, but they made a safe exit. She at one time brought as many as 7 or 8, several of whom were women and children. She was well known here in Chester County and in Philadelphia and respected by all true abolitionists. I had been in the habit of furnishing her and those that accompanied her as she returned from her acts of mercy with new shoes, and on one occasion when I had not seen her for 3 months, she came into my store, and I said, "Harriet, I am glad to see thee. I suppose thee wants a new pair of shoes." Her reply was, "I want more than that." I in jest said, "I have always been liberal with thee, and wish to be, but I am not rich and cannot afford to give much." Her reply was, "God tells me you have money for me." I asked her if God never deceived her. She said no. "Well, how much does thee want?" After studying a moment, she said, "About $23. I then gave her $24 and some odd cents. The net proceeds of £5 sterling received through Eliza Wigham of Scotland for her. I had given some accounts of Harriet's labors to the Anti-Slavery Society of Edinburgh, of which Eliza Wigham was secretary. On the reading of my letter, a gentleman present said he would send Harriet £4 if he knew of any way to get it to her. Eliza Wigham offered to forward it to me for her, and that was the first money ever received by me for her. Some 12 months after, she called on me again and said that God told her that I had some money for her, but not so much as before. I had a few days previous received the net proceeds of £1 10 from Europe for her. To say the least, there was something remarkable in these facts. Whether clairvoyancy or the divine impression on her mind from the source of all powers, I cannot tell, but certain it was she had a guide within herself over than the written word, for she never had any education. She brought away her aged parents into a singular manner. They started with an old horse fitted out in a punitive style with a straw collar, a pair of old chase wheels with a board on the axle to sit on, another board swung with ropes fastened to the axle to rest their feet on. She got her parents, who were both slaves belonging to different masters, on this rude vehicle to the railroad, put them in the cars, turned Jehu herself, and drove to town in a style that no human being ever did before or since, but she was happy at having arrived safely. Next day I furnished her with money to take them all to Canada. I afterwards sold their horse and sent them the balance of the proceeds. I believe that Harriet succeeded in freeing all of her relatives, but one sister and 3 children, etc., etc. Thy friend, Thomas Garrett. Friend Garrett probably refers here to those who passed through his hands. Harriet was obliged to come by many different routes on her different journeys, and though she never counted those whom she brought away with her, it would seem by the computation of others that there must have been somewhere near 300 brought to her by the northern states and Canada. Extracts from a letter written by Mr. Sanborn, Secretary of the Massachusetts Board of State Charities. My dear Madam, Mr. Phillips has sent me your note asking for a reminiscence of Harriet Tubman and testimony of her extraordinary story, with all her New England friends will, I am sure, be glad to furnish. I never had reason to doubt the truth of what Harriet said in regard to her own career, for I found her singularly truthful. Her imagination is warm and rich, and there is a whole region of the marvelous in her nature which has manifested itself in times remarkably. Her dreams and visions, misgivings and forewarnings ought not to be omitted in any life of hers, particularly those relating to John Brown. She was in his confidency in 1858 to 1859, and he had a great regard for her, which he often expressed to me. She aided him in his plans and expected to do so still further when his career was closed by that wonderful campaign in Virginia. The first time she came to my house in Concord after that tragedy, she was shown into a room in the evening where Brackett's bust of John Brown was standing. The sight of it, which was new to her, threw her into a sort of ecstasy of sorrow and admonition, and she went on in her rhapsody way to pronounce his apotheosis. She had often been in Concord, where she resided at the house of Emerson, Alcott, the Whitneys, the Brooks family, Mrs. Horace Mann, and other well-known persons. They all admired and respected her, and nobody doubted the reality of her adventures. She was too real a person to be suspected. In 1862, I think it was, she went from Boston to Port Royal under the advice and encouragement of Mr. Garrison, Governor Andrew, Dr. Howell, and other leading people. Her career in South Carolina is well known to some of our officers, and I think to Colonel Higginson, now of Newport, Rhode Island, and Colonel James Montgomery of Kansas, to both of whom she was useful as a spy and guide, if I mistake not. I regard her as, on the whole, the most extraordinary person of her race I have ever met. She is a Negro of pure and almost pure blood, can neither read nor write, has the characteristics of her race and condition, but she has done what can scarcely be credited on the best authority, and she has accomplished her purpose with a coolness, foresight, patience, and wisdom, which in a white man would have raised him to the highest pitch of reputation. I am, dear madam, very truly your servant, F. B. Sanborn. Of the dreams and visions mentioned in this letter, the writer might have given many wonderful instances, but it was thought best not to insert anything which, with any, might bring discredit upon the story. When these turns of solemnity come upon Harriet, she imagines that her spirit leaves her body and visits other scenes and places, not only in the world, but in the world of spirits. And her ideas of these scenes show, to say the least of it, a vividness of imagination seldom equaled in the stories of the most cultivated minds. Not long since, the writer, on going into Harriet's room in the morning, sat down by her and began to read that wonderful and glorious description of the heavenly Jerusalem in the last 2 chapters of Revelation. When the reading was finished, Harriet burst into a rhapsody, with perfectly amazed her hearers, telling of what she had seen in one of those visions, sights which no one could doubt had been real to her, and which no human imagination could have conceived. It would have seemed, unless in dream or vision, there was a wild poetry in these descriptions, which seemed to be border almost on inspiration, but as many that might be characterized as the ravings of insanity. All that can be said is, however, if this woman is insane, there has been a wonderful method in her madness. Leaving off on page 57. The Life of Harriet Tubman, page 57. At one time, Harriet was much troubled in spirit about her 3 brothers, feeling sure that some great evil was impending over their heads. She wrote a letter, by the hand of a friend, to a man named Jacob Jackson, who lived near there. Jacob was a free Negro. He could both read and write, and who was under suspicion at that time, as it had been thought he had something to do with the disappearance of so many slaves. It was necessary, therefore, to be very cautious in writing to him. Jacob had an adopted son, William Henry Jackson, also free, who had come south, and so Harriet determined to sign her letter with his name, knowing that Jacob would be clever enough to understand, by her particular phraseology, what meanings she intended to convey to him. She therefore, after speaking of indifferent matters, said, "Read my letter to the old folks, and give my love to them, and tell my brothers to be always watching unto prayer, and when the good old ship of Zion comes along, be ready to step aboard." The letter was signed, William Henry Jackson. Jacob was not allowed to have letters till the self-elected inspector had had the reading of them and studied into their secret meaning. They, therefore, got together with their glasses and got them on, and proceeded to a careful perusal of this mysterious document. What it meant they could not imagine. William Henry Jackson had no parents or brothers, and the letter was incomprehensible. White genius having exhausted itself, black genius was called in, and Jacob's letter was at last handed to him. Jacob saw it once what it meant, but tossed it down, saying, "That letter can't be meant for me, nohow. I can't make heads or tail of it," and walked off and took immediate measures to let Harriet's brothers know secretly that she was coming, and they must be ready to start at a moment's notice for the North. When Harriet arrived there, it was the day before Christmas, and she found her 3 brothers, who had attempted to escape, were advertised to be sold on Christmas Day to the highest bidder, to go down to the cotton and rice fields with the chain gang. Christmas came on Sunday, and therefore they were not to be sold till Monday. Harriet arrived on Saturday and gave them secret notice to be ready to start Saturday night. Immediately after dark, the first stopping place to be their father's cabin, 40 miles away. When they assembled, their brother John was missing, but when Harriet was ready, the word was forward, and she nibbler waited for no one. Poor John was almost ready to start when his wife was taken ill, and in an hour or two another little inheritor of the blessings of slavery had come into the world. John must go off for a granny, and then he would leave his wife in her present circumstances. But after the birth of the child, he began to think he must start the North and liberty, or the South and lifelong slavery. These were the alternatives, and this was his last chance. He tried again and again to steal out of the door, but a watchful eye was on him, and he was always arrested by the question, "Where you going, John?" At length he told her he was going to try to see if he couldn't get hired out on Christmas to another man. His wife did not think that he was to be sold. He went out of the door and stood by the corner of the house near her bed listening. At length he heard her sobbing and crying, and not being able to endure it, he went back. "Oh, John," said his wife, "you're going to leave me, but where'd we go? Remember, me and children." John went out and started at full speed to his father's cabin 40 miles away. At daybreak he overtook the others at the Fowler house near the cabin of their parents. Harriet had not seen her mother there for 6 years, but they did not dare to let the old woman know of their being in the neighborhood or of their intentions, for she would have raised such an uproar in her efforts to detain them with her that the whole plantation would have been alarmed. The poor old woman had been expecting the boys all day to spend Christmas with her as usual. She had been hard at work, had killed a pig, and put it to all the various uses to which sinner's flesh is doomed, and had made all the preparations for her circumstances admitted of, to give them a stupendous entertainment, and there she sat watching. In the night, when Harriet and 2 of her brothers and 2 other men who had escaped with them arrived at the Fowler house, they were exhausted and famished. They sent the 2 stranger men up to the house to try to speak to old Ben, their father, but not to let their mother know of their being in the neighborhood. The men succeeded in rousing old Ben, who came out, and as soon as he heard their story, he gathered together a quantity of provisions and came down to the Fowler house and slipped them inside the door, taking care not to see his children. Up among the ears of corn they lay, and one of them he had not seen for 6 years. It rained very hard all that Sunday, and they there lay all day, for they could not start till night. At about daybreak John joined them. There were wide chinks in the boards of the Fowler house, and through them they could see their father's cabin. And all day long, every few minutes, they would see the old woman come out, and shading her eyes with her hand, take a long look down the road to see if her children were coming. And when they almost couldn't hear her sigh, as she turned into the house disappointed. 2 or 3 times the old man came down and pushed food inside the door, and after nightfall he came to accompany them part of the way upon their journey. When he reached the Fowler house, he tied his handkerchief tight over his eyes, and 2 of his sons, taking him by each arm, he accompanied them some miles upon their journey. Then they bade him farewell and left him standing blindfolded in the middle of the road. When he could no longer hear their footsteps, he took off their handkerchiefs and turned back. But before leaving, they had gone up to the cabin to take a silent farewell of the poor old woman. Though the little window of the cabin, they saw the old woman sitting by her fire with a pipe in her hand, her head on her hand, rocking back and forth as she did, when she was in trouble, and wondering what new evil had come to her children. With streaming eyes they watched her for 10 to 15 minutes, but time was precious, and they must reach their next station before daybreak, and so they turned sadly away. When the holidays were over and the men came for the 3 brothers to sell them, they could not be found. The first place to search was, of course, the plantation, where all the relatives and friends lived. They went to the big house and asked the doctor if he had seen anything of them. The doctor said no. They mostly came up there to see the other niggers when they came for Christmas, but they hadn't been around at all. "Haven't been down to old Ben's?" the doctor asked. "Yes." "What does old Rick say?" Rick says he's not one of them came for Christmas. She was looking for him most of the day and most broke her heart about it. What does old Ben say? Old Ben says that he hasn't seen one of his children this Christmas. Well, if old Ben says that, they haven't been around. And so the manhunters went out disappointed. One of the other brothers, William Henry, had long been attached to a girl named Catherine, who lived with another master, but her master would not let her marry him. When William Henry made up his mind to start with Harriet, he determined to bring Kathleen with him. And so he went to the tailor's and bought a new suit of men's clothes and threw them over the garden fence of Catherine's master. The gardener ran down to a run, and Catherine had been notified where to find the clothes. When the time had come to get ready, Kathleen went to the foot of the garden and dressed herself in the suit of men's clothes. She was soon missed, and all the girls in the house were set to looking for Catherine. Presently they saw coming through the garden, as if from a river, a well-dressed little darky, and they all stopped looking for Catherine to stare at him. He walked directly by them round the house and went out the gate without the slightest suspicion of being excited as to who he was. In a fortnight from that time, the whole party were safe in Canada. William Henry died in Canada, but Catherine had been seen and talked with by the writer at the house of the old people. Of the many letters, testimonies, and passes passed in the hands of the writer by Harriet, the following were selected for insertions in this book and are quite sufficient to verify her statements. A letter from General Sackton to Our Lady of Auburn, Atlanta, Georgia, March 21st, 1868. My dear Madam, I have just received your letter informing me that Honorable William H. Stewart, Secretary of State, would present a petition to Congress for a pension to Harriet Tubman for services rendered in the Union Army during the late war. I can bear witness to the value of her services in South Carolina and Florida. She was employed in the hospitals and as a spy. She made many a raid inside the enemy's lines, displaying remarkable courage, zeal, and fidelity. She was employed by General Hunter, and I think by General Stevens and Sherman, and as deserving of a pension from the government for her services as any other of its faithful servants. I am truly, verily yours, Rufus Saxton, BVT, Brigadier General, USA. Letter from the Honorable William H. Stewart, Washington, July 25th, 1868. Madam General Hunter, my dear sir, Harriet Tubman, a colored woman, has been nursing our soldiers during nearly all the war. She believes she has a claim for faithful services to the command in South Carolina, which you are connected, and she thinks that you would be disposed to see her claim justly settled. I have known her long, and a nobler and higher spirit of a truer seldom dwells in human form. I commend her, therefore, to your kind and best attention. Faithfully yours, William H. Stewart. Letter from Colonel James Montgomery, St. Helena Island, South Carolina, July 6, 1863. Headquarters, Colored Brigade. Brigadier General Gilman, Commanding Department of the South. General, I wish to commend to your attention Mrs. Harriet Tubman, a most remarkable woman and invaluable as a scout. I have been acquainted with her character and actions for several years. Walter D. Plowden is a man of tried courage and can be made highly useful. I am, General, your most obliged servant, James Montgomery, Colonel Commander Brigade. Letter from Mrs. General A. Bodard, B-A-I-R-D, Peterborough, November 24th, 1864. The bearer of this, Harriet Tubman, a most excellent woman, who has rendered faithful and good services to our Union Army, not only in the hospital, but in various capacities, having been employed under government at Hilton Head and in Florida, and I commend her to the protection of all officers in whose department she may happen to be. She has been known and esteemed for years by the family of my uncle, Honorable Garrett Smith, as a person of great vicissitude and capacities. Mrs. General A. B-A-I-R-D. Letter from Honorable Garrett Smith, Peterborough, New York, November 4th, 1867. I have known Mrs. Harriet Tubman for many years. Seldom, if ever, have I met with a person more philanthropic, more self-denying, and of more bravery. Nor must I omit to say that she combines with her sublime spirit remarkable discernment and judgment. During the late war, Mrs. Tubman was eminently faithful and useful in the cause of our country. She is poor and has poor parents. Such a servant of the country should be well paid by the country. I hope the government will look into her case. Garrett Smith. Testimonial from Garrett Smith, Petersboro, November 22nd, 1864. The bearer, Harriet Tubman, needs not any recommendation. Nearly all the nation over she has been heard of for her wisdom, integrity, patriotism, and bravery. The cause of freedom owes her much. The country owes her much. I have known Harriet for many years, and I hold her in my highest esteem. Garrett Smith. Certificate from Henry K. Durant, Acting Assistant Surgeon, USA. I certify that I have been acquainted with Harriet Tubman for nearly 2 years, and my position as medical officer in charge of contrabands in this town and in the hospital has given me frequent and ample opportunities to observe her general deportment, particularly her kindness and attention to the sick and suffering of her own race. I take much pleasure in testifying to the esteem in which she is generally held. Henry K. Durant, Acting Assistant Surgeon, USA. In charge, Contraband Hospital. Dated at Beaufort, South Carolina, on the 3rd day of May, 1864. I concur fully in the above. R. Saxton, Brigadier General, VOL, period. The following are a few of the passages used by Harriet throughout the war. Many others are so defaced that it is impossible to decipher them. Headquarters, Department of the South, Hilton Head, Port Royal, South Carolina, November 19, 1863. Pass the bearer, Harriet Tubman, to Beaufort and back to this place and wherever she wishes to go, and give her free passage at all time, all on government transports. Harriet was sent to me from Boston by Governor Andrew of Massachusetts, and is a valuable woman. She has permission as a servant of the government to pursue such provisions from the commissary she may need. D. Hunter, Major General, Commander. General Gilman, who succeeded General Hunter in command of the Department of the South, appends her signature to the same pass. Headquarters of the Department of the South, July 1st, 1863. Continued in force. I. A. Gilman, Brigadier General, Commander. Beaufort, August 28, 1862. Will Captain Warfield please let, quote, Moses, unquote, have a little bourbon whiskey for medicinal purposes. Henry K. Durant, Acting Assistant Surgeon. War Department, Washington, D.C., March 20th, 1865. Pass Mrs. Harriet Tubman, colored, to Hilton's Head in Charleston, South Carolina, with free transportation on the government transport. By order of the Secretary of War, Lewis H., Assistant Adjutant General, USA, to BBT, Brigadier General Van Vliet, at USQM NU, not transferable. Ending off on page 69 at the very end. Some scenes in the War Department, Washington, D.C., July 22nd, 1865. Permit Harriet Tubman to proceed to Fortress Monroe, Virginia, on a government transport. Transportation will be furnished free of cost by the order of the Secretary of War. L.H. Assistant Adjutant General, non-transferable. Appointment as nurse. Sir, I have the honor to inform you that the Medical Director, Department of Virginia, has been instructed to appoint Harriet Tubman, nurse or matron, at the Colored Hospital, Fort Monroe, Virginia. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, V. K. Barnes, Servant General. Honorable William H. Stewart, Secretary of State, Washington, D.C. Names of Harriet's assistants, scouts, or pilots. Scouts who are residents of Beaufort and well acquainted with the mainland: Peter Barnes, Mont Blake, Sandy Selters, Solomon Gregory, Isaac Hayward, Gabriel Coham, George Chisholm. Pilots who know the channels of the river in this vicinity and who acted as much for Colonel Montgomery up the Combahee River: Charles Simmons, Samuel Hayward. APP''D, R. Saxton, Brigadier General. At this point, the following good and kind letter from Reverend Harry Fowler is received. Auburn, June 23, 1868. My dear friend, I wish to say to you how gratified I am that you are writing the biography of Harriet Tubman. I feel that her life forms part of the history of the country, and that it ought not to depend upon tradition to keep it in remembrancy. Had not the pressure of professional claims prevented, I should have aspired to be her historian myself. But my disappointment in this regard is more than meet by the satisfaction experienced in hearing that you are the chosen Marian of the African Moses, the name by which she was known among her emancipated followers from the land of bondage. Blessed be God, a greater than Moses has at last broken every bond. As ever, with warm regard, your friend, Henry Fowler. The second account of the subject of this memoir is cut from the Boston Commonwealth of 1863, kindly sent the letter by Mr. Sanborn. It was said long ago that the true romance of America was not in the fortunes of the Indian, where Cowper sought it, nor in the New England character, where Judd found it, nor in the social contrast of Virginia planters, as Thackeray imagined, but in the story of the fugitive slaves. The observation is as true now as it was before war. With swift, gigantic hand stretched the vast shadows and dashed in the high lights in which romance loves to lurk and flash forward. But the stage is enlarged on which these dramas are played. The whole world now sits as spectators, and the desperation of the malignity of a poor black woman has power to shake the nation that so long was deaf to her cries. We write of one of these heroines on whom our slave annuals are full, a woman whose career is as extraordinary as the most famous of her sex can show. Araminta Ross was known by her married name of Tubman, with her sounding Christian name changed to Harriet, is the granddaughter of a slave imported from Africa, and has not a drop of white blood in her vein. Her parents were Benjamin Ross and Harriet Green, both slaves, but married and faithful to each other. They still live in old age and poverty, but free, on a little property in Elburn, New York, which their daughter purchased for them from Mr. Stewart, the Secretary of State. She was born, as near as she can remember, in 1820 or 1821 in Dorchester County, on the eastern shore of Maryland, and not far from the town of Cambridge. She had 10 brothers and sisters, of whom 3 are now living, all at the North, and all rescued from slavery by Harriet before the war. She went back just as the South was preparing to secede, to bring away a fourth, but before she could reach her, she was dead. 3 years before, she had brought away her old father and mother at great risk to herself. When Harriet was 6 years old, she was taken from her mother and carried 10 miles to live with James Cook, whose wife was a weaver, to learn the trade of weaving. While still a mere child, Cook set her to watching his muskrat traps, which compelled her to wade through the water. It happened that she was once sent, when she was ill with the measles, and taking cold from wading in the water, in the condition she grew very sick, and her mother persuaded her master to take her away from Cook's until she could get well. Another attempt was made to teach her weaving, but she would not learn, for she hated her mistress and did not want to live at home, as she would have done as a weaver, for it was the custom then to weave the cloth for the family, or a part of it, in the house. Soon after she entered her teens, she was hired out as a field hand, and it was while thus employed that she received a wound which nearly proved fatal, from the effects of which she still suffers. In the fall of the year, the slaves there work in the evening, cleaning up wheat, husking corn, etc. On this occasion, one of the slaves of a farmer named Barrett left his work and went to the village store in the evening. The overseer followed him, and so did Harriet. When the slave was found, the overseer swore he should be whipped, and called on Harriet, among others, to help tie him. She refused, and as the man ran away, she placed herself in the door to stop the pursuit. The overseer caught up a 2-pound weight from the counter and threw it at the fugitive, but it fell short and struck Harriet a stunning blow on the head. It was long before she recovered from this, and it has left her subject to a sort of stupor or lethargic at times, coming upon her in the midst of conversation or whatever she may be doing, and throwing her into a deep slumber, from which she will presently rouse herself or go on with her conversation or work. After this she lived for 5 or 6 years with John Stewart, where at first she worked in the house, but afterwards hired her time, and Dr. Thompson, son of her master's guardian, stood with her for her, that is, was her surety for the payment of what she owed. She employed the time thus hired in the rudest labors, drove oxen, carted, plowed, and did all the work of a man, sometimes earning money enough in a year beyond what she paid her master to buy a pair of steers worth $40. The amount exacted of a woman for her time was $50 or $60, of a man $100 to $150. Frequently, Harriet worked for her father, who was a timber inspector and superintended the cutting and hauling of great quantities of timber for the Baltimore shipyards. Stewart, his temporary master, was a builder, and for the work of Ross used to receive as much as $5 a day sometimes, he being a superior workman. While engaged with her father, she would cut wood, haul logs, etc. Her usual stint was half a cord of wood in a day. Harriet was married somewhere between 1844 to a free-colored man named John Tubman, but she had no children. For the last 2 years of slavery she lived with Dr. Thompson, before mentioned, her own master not being yet of age, and Dr. T's father being his guardian as well as the owner of her own father. In 1849 the young man died, and the slaves were to be sold, though previously set free by an old will. Harriet resolved not to be sold, and so with no knowledge of the North, having only heard of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, she walked away one night alone. She found a friend and a white lady who knew her story and helped her on her way. After many adventures she reached Philadelphia, where she found work and earned a small stock of money. With this money in her purse she traveled back to Maryland for her husband, but she found him married to another woman and no longer caring to live with her. This, however, was not until 2 years after her escape, for she does not seem to have reached her old home in her first 2 expeditions. In December 1850 she had visited Baltimore and brought away her sister and 2 children, who had come up from Cambridge in a boat under charge of her sister's husband, a free black. A few months after she had brought away her brother and 2 other men, it was not until the fall of 1851 that she found her husband and learned of his infidelity. She did not give way to rage or grief, but collected a party of fugitives and brought them safely to Philadelphia. In December of the same year she returned and led out a party of 11, among them her brother and his wife. With these she journeyed to Canada and there spent the winter, for this was after the enforcement of Macy's fugitive slave bill in Philadelphia and Boston, and there was no safety except under the paw of the British lion, as she quaintly said. But the first winter was terribly severe for these poor runaways. They earned their bread by chopping wood in the snows of the Canadian forest. They were frostbitten, hungry, and naked. Harriet was their good angel. She kept house for her brother, and the poor creatures boarded with her. She worked for them, begged for them, prayed for them, with the strange familiarity of communion with God, which seems natural to these people, and carried them, by the help of God, through the hard winter. In the spring, she returned to the States, and, as usual, earned money by working in hotels and families as a cook. From Cape May, in the fall of 1852, she went back once more to Maryland and brought away 9 more fugitives. Up to this time she had expended chiefly her own money in these expeditions, money which she had earned by hard work and the drudgery of the kitchen. Never did anyone more exactly fulfill the sense of George Herbert: "A man with his claws makes drudgery divine." But it was not possible for such virtues long to remain hidden from the keen eyes of the abolitionist. She became known to Thomas Garrett, the large-hearted Quaker of Wilmington, who has aided the escape of 3,000 fugitives. She found warm friends in Philadelphia and New York and wherever she went. These gave her money, which she never spent for her own use, but laid up for the help of her people and especially for her journeys back to the land of Egypt, as she called her old home, by reason of her frequent visits there, always carrying away some of the oppressed. She got among her people the name of Moses, which it seems she still retains. Between 1852 and 1857, she made but 2 of these journeys, in consequence partly of the increased vigilance of the slaveholders who had suffered so much by the loss of their property. A great reward was offered for her capture, and she several times was on the point of being taken, but always escaped by her quick wit or by warnings from heaven. For it is time to notice one singular trait of her character. She is the most shrewd and practical person in the world, yet she is a firm believer in omens, dreams, and warnings. She declares that before her escape from slavery, she used to dream of flying over fields and towns and rivers and mountains, looking down upon them like a bird, and reaching at last a great fence, or sometimes a river, over which she would try to fly. But it paired like I wouldn't have it the strength, and just as I was sinking down, there would be ladies all dressed in white over there, and they would put out their arms and pull me cross. There is nothing strange in this, perhaps, but she declares that when she came north she remembered these very places, as though she had seen her dreams, and many of the ladies who befriended her were those who had been helped by in her visions. Then she says she always knows when there is danger near. She does not know how exactly, but pairs like my heart go flutter, flutter, and then they may say, peace, peace, as much as they likes. I know it's going to be war. She's very firm on this point and ascribes to this her great impunity, in spite of the lethargy being mentioned, which would seem likely to throw her into the hands of her enemies. She says she inherited this power, that her father could always predict the weather, and that he foretold the Mexican War. In 1867 she made her most venturesome journey, for she brought with her to the north her old parents, who were no longer able to walk such distances as she might go by night. Consequently, she must hire a wagon for them, and it required all her ingenuity to get them through Maryland and Delaware safe. She accomplished it, however, and by the aid of her friends, she brought them safe to Canada, where they spent the winter. Her account of their sufferings there, of her mother's complaining, and her own philosophy about it, is a lesson of trust and providency better than in many sermons. But she decided to bring them to a more comfortable place, and so she negotiated with Mr. Stewart, then in the Senate, for a little patch of ground with a house on it at Auburn, near his own home. To the credit of the Secretary of State, it should be said that he sold her the property on very favorable terms, and gave her some time for payment. To this house she removed her parents, and set herself to work to pay for her purchase. It was on this errand that she first visited Boston, we believe in the winter of 1858-1859. She brought a few letters from her friends in New York, but she could herself neither read nor write, and she was obliged to trust to her wits that they were delivered to the right persons. One of them, as it happened, was to the present writer, who received it by another hand, and called to see her at her boarding house. It was curious to see the caution with which she received her visitors, until she was assured that there was no mistake. One of her means of security was to carry with her the Derringer types of her friends, and show them to each new person. If they recognized the likeness, then it was all right. Pains were taken to secure her the attention to which her great service to humanity entitled her, and she left New England with a handsome sum of money towards the payment of her debt to Mr. Stewart. Before she left, however, she had several interviews with Captain Brown, then in Boston. He is supposed to have communicated his plans to her, and to have been aided by her in obtaining recruits and money among her people. At any rate, he always spoke of her with the greatest respect, and declared that General Tubman, as he styled her, was a better officer than most whom he had seen, and could command an army as successfully as she led her small parties of fugitives. Her own veneration for Captain Brown has always been profound, and since his murder has taken the form of a religion. She had often risked her own life for her people, and she thought nothing of that. But that a white man, and a man so noble and strong, should so take upon himself the burden of a despised race, she could not understand. And she took refuge from her perplexity in the mysteries of her favorite religion. Again, she laid great stress on a dream which she had just before she met Captain Brown in Canada. She thought she was in a wilderness sort of place, all full of rocks and bushes, when she saw a serpent raise its head among the rocks, and as it did so, it became the head of an old man with a long white beard, gazing at her wistful-like, just as if he were going to speak to me. And then two other heads rose up beside him, younger than he, and as she stood looking at them, and wondering what they could want with her, a great crowd of men rushed in and struck down the younger heads, and then the head of the old man, still looking at her so wistful. This dream she had again and again, and could not interpret it. But when she met Captain Brown, shortly after, behold, he was the very image of the head she had seen. But still she could not make out what her dream signified, till the news came to her of the tragedy of Harper Ferry, and then she knew the two other heads were his two sons. She was in New York at the time, and on the day of the affair at Harper's Ferry, she felt her usual warning that something was wrong, but could not tell what. Finally, she told her hostess that it must be Captain Brown who was in trouble, and that they should soon hear bad news from him. The next day's newspaper brought tidings of what had happened. Her last visit to Maryland was made after this in December 1860, and in spite of the agitated condition of the country and the greater watchfulness of the slave holders, she brought away 7 fugitives, one of them an infant, which must be drugged with opium to keep it from crying on the way, and so revealing the hiding place of the party. She brought these safely to New York, but there was a new difficulty met her. It was the mad winter of compromises, when state after state and politician after politician went down on their knees to beg the South not to secede. The hunting of fugitive slaves began again. Mr. Stewart went over to the side of compromise. He knew the history of this poor woman. He had given his enemies a hold on him by dealing with her. It was thought he could not scruple to betray her. The suspicion was an unworthy one, for though the secretary could betray a cause, he could not surely have put her enemies on the track of a woman who was thus in his power after such a career as hers had been. But so little confidence was then felt in Mr. Stewart by men who had voted for him and with him, that they hurried Harriet off to Canada, sorely against her will. She did not long remain there. The war broke out for which she had been looking, and she hastened to her New York friends to prepare for another expedition to Maryland to bring away the last of her family. Before she could start, however, the news came of the capture of Port Royal. Instantly she conceived the idea of going there and working among her people on the islands and the mainland. Money was given her, a pass was secured through the agency of Governor Andrew, and she went to Beaufort. There she has made herself useful in many ways, has been employed as a spy by General Hunter, and finally was piloted Colonel Montgomery on his most successful expedition. We gave some notice of this fact last week. Since then we have received the following letter, dictated by her, from which it appears that she needs some contributions for her work. We trust she will receive them, for none has better deserved it. She asks nothing for herself except that her wardrobe may be replenished, and even this she will probably share with the first needy person she meets. Beaufort, South Carolina, June 30th, 1863. Last fall, when the people here became very much alarmed for fear of an invasion from the rebels, all my clothes were packed and sent with others to Hilton Head and lost. I have never been able to get any trace of them since. I was sick at the time and unable to look after them myself. I want, among the rest, a bloomer dress, some made of coarse, strong material to wear on expeditions. In our late expedition up the Combahee River, in coming on board the boat, I was carrying 2 pigs for a poor sick woman who had a child to carry, and the order "double quick" was given, and I started to run. Stepped in my dress, it being rather long, and fell and tore it almost off, so that when I got on board the boat there was hardly anything left of it but shreds. I made up my mind then I would never wear a long dress on another expedition of the kind, but would have a bloomer as soon as I could get it. So please make this known to the ladies, if you will, for I expect to have use for it very soon, probably before they can get it to me. You have without doubt seen a full account of the expedition I refer to. Don't you think we colored people are entitled to some credit for that exploit under the head of the brave Colonel Montgomery? We weakened the rebels somewhat on the Combahee River by taking and bringing away 756 head of their most valuable livestock, known up in your region as contrabands, and this too without the loss of a single life on our part, though we had good reason to believe that a number of rebels bit the dust. Of these 756 contrabands, nearly or quite all the able men have joined the color regiments here. I have now been absent 2 years almost, and have just got letters from my friends in Auburn urging me to come home. My father and mother are old and in feeble health and need my care and attention. I hope the good people there will not allow them to suffer, and I do not believe they will. But I do not see how I am to leave at present the very important work to be done here. Among other duties which I have is that of looking after the hospital here for contrabands. Most of those coming from the mainland are very destitute, almost naked. I am trying to find places for those able to work and provide for them as best I can, so as to lighten the burden on the government as much as possible, while at the same time they learn to respect themselves by earning their own living. Remember me very kindly to Mrs. and her daughters. Also, if you will, to my Boston friends, Mrs. C., Miss H., and especially to Mr. and Mrs. George L. Stearns, to whom I am under great obligation for their many kindnesses. I shall be sure to come and see you all if I live to go north. If you write, direct your letter to the care of C. In the spring of 1860, Harriet Tubman was requested by Mr. Gerrit Smith to go to Boston to attend a large anti-slavery meeting. On her way, she stopped at Troy to visit a cousin. While there, the colored people were one day startled with the intelligence that a fugitive slave by the name of Charles Nalle had been followed by his master, who was a younger brother and not one grain whiter than he, and that he was already in the hands of the officers and was to be taken back to the South. The instant Harriet heard the news, she started for the office of the U.S. Commissioner, scattering the tidings as she went. An excited crowd were gathered about the office, through which Harriet forced her way and rushed upstairs to the door of the room where the fugitive was detained. A wagon was already waiting before the door to carry off the man, but the crowd was even then so great and in such a state of excitement that the officers did not dare to bring the man down. On the opposite side of the street stood the colored people, watching the window where they could see Harriet's sunbonnet, and feeling assured that so long as she stood there, the fugitive was still in the office. Time passed on, he did not appear. "They've taken him out another way, depend upon that," said some of the colored people. "No," replied others, "there stands Moses yet, and as long as she is there, he is safe." Harriet, now seeing the necessity for a tremendous effort for his rescue sent out some little boys to cry fire. The bells rang. The crowd increased till the whole street was a dense mass of people. Again and again the officers came out to try and clear the stairs and make a way to take their captive down. Others were driven down, but Harriet stood her ground, her head bent down and her arms folded. "Come, old woman, you must get out of this," said one of the officers. "I must have the way cleared. If you can't get down alone, someone will help you." Harriet, still putting on a greater appearance of discrepitude, twitched away from him and kept her place. Officers were made to buy Charles from his master, who at first agreed to take $1,200 for him. But when that was subscribed, he immediately raised the price to $1,500. The crowd grew more excited. A gentleman raised a window and called out $200 for his rescue, but not 1 cent to his master. This was responded to by a roar of satisfaction from the crowd below. At length the officers appeared and announced to the crowd that if they would open a lane to the wagon, they would promise to bring the man down the front way. The lane was open and the man was brought out, a tall, handsome, intelligent white man, with his wrists mangled together, walking between the U.S. Marshal and another officer. Behind him his brother and his master, so like him that one could hardly be told from the other. The moment they appeared, Harriet roused from her stooping posture, threw open a window, and cried to her friends, "Here he comes, take him," and then darted down the stairs like a wildcat. She seized one officer, pulled him down, then another, and tore him away from the man. Keeping her arms above the slave, she cried to her friends, "Drag us out, drag him to the river, drown him, don't let them have him." They were knocked down together, and while down she tore off her sunbonnet and tied it on the head of the fugitive. When he rose, only his head could be seen, and amongst the surging mass of the people the slave was no longer recognized, while the master appeared like the slave. Again and again they were knocked down, the poor slave utterly helpless, with his mangled wrists streaming with blood. Harriet's outer clothes were torn from her, and even her stout shoes were all pulled from her feet, yet she never relinquished her hold of the man, till she had dragged him to the river, where he was tumbled into a boat, Harriet following in a ferry boat on the other side. But the telegraph was ahead of him. As soon as they landed, he was seized and hurried from her sight. After a time, some schoolchildren came hurrying along, and to her anxious inquiries, they answered, "He's up in that house in the 3rd story." Harriet rushed to the place. Some men were attempting to make their way up the stairs. The officers were firing down, and 2 men were lying on the stairs who had been shot. Over other bodies our heroine rushed, and with the help of others burst open the door of the room, dragged out the fugitive, whom Harriet carried downstairs in her arms. A gentleman who was riding by with a fine horse stopped to ask what the disturbance meant, and on hearing the story his sympathies seemed to be thoroughly aroused. He sprang from his wagon, calling out, "That is a blood horse. Drive him till he drops." The poor man was hurried in. Some of his friends jumped in after him and drove at the most rapid speed to Schenectady. This is the story Harriet told to the writer. By some persons it seemed too wonderful for belief, and an attempt was made to corroborate it. Reverend Henry Fowler, who was at the time at Saratoga, kindly volunteered to go to Troy and assert the facts. His report was that he had had a long interview with Mr. Townsend, who acted during the trial as counsel for the slave, that he had given him a rich narration, which he would write out the next week for this little book. But before he was to begin his generous labor, and while engaged in some kind efforts for the prisoners at Auburn, he was stricken down by the heat of the sun, and it was a long time debarred from labor. Fugitive Slave Rescue in Troy. From the Troy Whig, April 28, 1859. Yesterday afternoon, the streets of this city in West Troy were made the scenes of unexampled excitement. For the first time since the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, an attempt was made here to carry its provisions into execution, and the result was a terrific encounter between the officers and the prisoners' friends, the triumph of mob law, and the final rescue of the fugitive. Our city was thrown into a grand state of turmoil, and for a time every other topic was forgotten to give place to this new excitement. People did not think last evening to ask who was nominated at Charleston, or whether the news of the Heenans and Sayers battle had arrived. Everything was merged into the fugitive slave case, of which it seemed the end is not yet. Charles Nalle, the fugitive who was the cause of this excitement, was a slave on the plantation of B.W. Hansborough. It's Hansboroughh in Culpeper County, Virginia, till the 19th of October, 1858, when he made his escape and went to live in Columbia, Pennsylvania. A wife and 5 children are residing there now. Not long since he came to Sand Lake in this county and resided in the family of Mr. Crosby until about 3 weeks ago. Since that time he has been employed as coachman by Uri Gilbert, Esquire, of this city. He is about 30 years of age, tall, quite light-complected, and good-looking. He is said to have been an excellent and faithful servant. At Sand Lake, we understand that Nalle was often seen by one H.F. Averill, Averill, formerly connected with one of the papers of the city, who communicated with his reputed owner in Virginia and gave the information that led to a knowledge of the whereabouts of the fugitive. Averill wrote letters for him and thus obtained acquaintancy with his history. Mr. Hansborough sent on an agent, Henry J. Wall, by whom the necessary papers were got out to arrest the fugitive. Yesterday morning, about 11 o'clock, Charles Nalle was sent to procure some bread for the family by whom he was employed. He failed to return. At the baker's, he was arrested by Deputy United States Marshal J.W. Holmes and immediately taken before the United States Commissioner Miles Breach. The son of Mr. Gilbert, thinking it strange that he did not come back, sent to the house of William Henry on Division Street, where he boarded, and his whereabouts was discovered. The examination before Commissioner Beach was quite brief. The evidence of Averill and the agent was taken, and the commissioner decided to remain Nalle to Virginia. The necessary papers were made out and given to the marshal. By this time it was 2 o'clock, and the fact began to be noised abroad that there was a fugitive slave in Mr. Beach's office, corner of State and First Street. People in knots of 10 or 12 collected near the entrance looking at Nalle, who could be seen in an upper window. William Henry, a colored man with whom Nalle boarded, commenced talking from the curbstone in a loud voice to the crowd. He uttered some sentences as, "There is a fugitive slave in that office. Pretty soon you will see him come forth. He is going to be taken down south, and you will have a chance to see him. He is to be taken to the depot to go to Virginia in the first train. Keep watch of those stairs, and you will have a sight." A number of women kept shouting and crying, and by loud appeals excited the colored persons assembled. Still the crowd grew in numbers. Wagons halted in front of the locality and were soon piled with spectators. An alarm of fire was sounded, and hose carriages dashed through the ranks of men, women, and boys. But they closed again and kept looking with expectant eyes at the window where the Negro was visible. Meanwhile, angry discussions commenced. Some persons agitated a rescue. Others favored law and order. Mr. Brockway, a lawyer, had his coat torn for expressing his sentiments, and other melees kept the interest alive. All at once there was a wild hula, and every eye was turned up to see the legs and part of the body of the prisoner protruding from the second-story window, at which he was endeavoring to escape. Then arose a shout, "Drop him! Catch him! Hooray!" But the attempt was a fruitless one, for somebody in the office pulled Nalle back again amidst the shouts of 100 pairs of lungs. The crowd at that time numbered nearly 1,000 persons, many of whom were black, and a good share were of the female sex. They blocked up State Street from First Street to the alley and kept surging to and fro. Martin I. Townsend, Esquire, who acted as counsel for the fugitive, did not arrive in the commissioner's office until a decision had been rendered. He immediately went before Judge Gould of the Supreme Court and procured a writ of habeas corpus in the usual form, returnable immediately. This was given Deputy Sheriff Nathaniel Upham, who at once proceeded to Commissioner Beach's office and served it on Holmes. Very injudiciously, the officers proceeded at once to Judge Good's G-U-L-D'(S) office, although it was evident they would have to pass through an excited and unreasonable crowd. As soon as the officers and their prisoner emerged from the door, an old Negro who had been standing at the bottom of the stairs shouted, "Here they come!" And the crowd made a terrible rush at the party. From the office of Commissioner Beach in the Mutual Building to that of Judge Gould, G-O-U-L-D, in Congress Street, in less than 2 blocks, it was made a regular battlefield. The moment the prisoner emerged from the doorway in custody of Deputy Sheriff Upham, Chief of Police Quinn, officers Cleveland and Holmes, the crowd made one grand surge, and those nearest the prisoner seized him violently with the intent of pulling him away from the officers, but they were foiled, and down first to Congress Street and up the ladder in front of Judge Good's chambers went the surging mass. Excitedly what it did go on in the crowd is impossible to say, but the pulling, hauling, mauling, and shouting gave evidence of frantic efforts on the part of the rescuers and a stern resistance from the conservators of the law. In front of Judge Good's office, the combat was at its height. No stones or other missiles were used. The battle was fist to fist. We believe an order was given to take the prisoner the other way, and there was a grand rush towards the west, past First and River Streets, as far as Dock Street. All this time, there was a continual melee. Many of the officers were hurt, among them Mr. Upham, whose object was solely to do his duty by taking Nellie before Judge Gold's in accordance with the right of habeas corpus. A number of the crowd were more or less hurt, and it is any wonder that these were not badly injured, as pistols were drawn and chisels used. The battle had raged as far as the corner of Dock and Congress Streets, and the victory remained with the rescuers at last. The officers were completely worn out from their exertions, and it was impossible to continue their hold upon him any longer. Nellie was at liberty. His friends rushed him down Dock Street to the lower ferry, where there was a curse lying ready to start. The fugitive was put in, and the Roman rode off, and amongst the shouts of hundreds who lined the banks of the river, Nellie was carried into Albany County. As the Skirks landed in West Troy, a Negro sympathizer waded up to his waist and pulled Nellie out of the boat. He went up the hill alone, however, and there who could he meet but Constable Becker. The latter official, seeing a man with manacles on, considered his duty to arrest him. He did so, and took him in a wagon to the office of Justice Stewart on the second floor of the corner building in the ferry. The justice was absent. When the crowd on the Troy bank had seen Nellie safely landed, it was suggested he might be recaptured. Then there was another rush made for the steam ferry boat, which carried over about 400 people and left as many more, a few of the latter being soused in their effort to get on the boat. On landing in West Troy there, sure enough, was the prisoner locked up in a strong office protected by Officer Becker, Brown, and Morrison, and the door barricaded. Not a moment was lost. Upstairs went a score or more of result men, the rest piling in, promiscuously shouting and extricating the officers. Soon a stone flew against the door, then another, and bang, bang, went off a couple of pistols. But the officers who fired them took great care to aim pretty high. The assailants were forced to retreat for a moment. "They've got pistols," said one. "Who cares?" was the reply. "They can only kill a dozen of us. Come on." More stones and more pistol shots ensued. At last the door was pulled open by an immense Negro, and in a moment he was felled by a hatchet in the hands of Deputy Sheriff Morrison. But the body of the fallen man blocked up the door so that it could not be shut, and a friend of the prisoner pulled him out. Poor fellow, he might well say, "Save me from my friends." Amidst the pulling and hauling, the iron had cut his arms, which were bleeding profusely, and he could hardly walk owing to fatigue. He has since arrived safely in Canada. Statements made by Martin I. Townsend, Esquire of Troy, who was counsel for the fugitive Charles Nellie. Nellie is an octoroon. His wife was the same infusion of Caucasian blood. She was the daughter of her master and had, with her sister, been bred by him in his family as his own child. When the father died, both of these daughters were married and had large families of children. Under the highly Christian national laws of old Virginia, these children were the slaves of their grandfather. The old man died, leaving a will whereby he manumitted his daughters and their children and provided for their purchase of the freedom of their husbands. The manumission of the children and grandchildren took effect, but the estate was insufficient to purchase the husbands of their daughters and the father of his grandchildren. The manumit by another Christian, conservative, and national provision of law were forced to leave the state while their slave husbands remained in slavery. Nellie and his brother-in-law were allowed for a while to visit their families outside Virginia about once a year, but were at length ordered to provide themselves with new wives, as they would be allowed to visit their former ones no more. It was after this that Nellie and his brother-in-law started for the land of freedom, guided by the steady light of the North Star. Thank God, neither family now need fear any earthly master or the bay of bloodhound dogging their fugitive steps. Nellie returned to Troy with his family about July 1860 and resided with them there for more than 7 years. They are all now residents of the city of Washington, D.C. Nellie and his family are persons of refined manners and of the highest respectability. Several of his children are red-headed, and a stranger would discover no trace of African blood in their complexion or features. It was the head of this family whom H. F. Averill, Averill, proposed to doom to returnless exile and lifelong slavery. When Niall was brought from Commissioner Beach's office into the street, Harriet Tubman, who had been standing with the excited crowd, rushed among the foremost to Nellie, and running one of her arms round his manacled arm, held on to him without ever losing her hold through the more than half-hour struggle to Judge Gord's office and from Judge Gord's office to the dock, where Nellie's liberation was accomplished. In the middle, she was repeatedly beaten over the head with policemen's clubs, but she never for a moment released her hold, but cheered Nellie and her friends with her voice and struggled with the officers until they were liberally worn out with their exertions and Nellie was separated from them. True, she had strong and earnest helpers in her struggle, some of whom had white faces as well as human hearts and are now in heaven. But she exposed herself to the fury of sympathizers with slavery without fear and suffered their blows without flinching. Harriet crossed the river with the crowd in the ferry boat, and when the men who led the assault upon the door of Judge Stewart's office were stricken down, Harriet and a number of other colored women rushed over their bodies, brought Nellie out, and putting him in the first wagon passing, started him for the west. A livery team driven by a colored man was immediately sent on to relieve the other, and Nellie was seen about Troy no more until he returned a free man by purchase from his master. Harriet also disappeared and the crowd dispersed. How she came to be in Troy that day is entirely unknown to our citizens, and where she hid herself after the rescue is equally a mystery, for her struggle was in the sight of 1,000, perhaps of 5,000 spectators. This woman of whom you have been reading is poor and partially disabled from her injuries, yet she supports her cheerfully and uncomplainingly herself and her old parents, and always has several poor children in her home who are dependent entirely upon her exertions. At present she has 3 of these children for whom she is providing, while her parents are working to pay back money borrowed to bring them on. She also maintains her exertions among the good people of Elburn, 2 schools of freemen in the South, providing them teachers and sending them clothes and books. She never asks for anything for herself, but she does ask the charity of the public for her people. For them her tears will fall, for them her prayers ascend. To them her toils and cares be given, till toils and cares will end. If any persons are disposed to aid her in her benevolent efforts, they may send donations to Reverend S. M. Hopkins, professor of Elburn Theological Seminary, who will make such disposition of the funds sent as may be designated by the donors. End of the book, Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman. Next will be added the appendix, having been read by Peter John Parisis. Appendix. A few circumstances having come out in conversations with Harriet, they are added here as they may be of interest to the reader. On asking Harriet particularly as to the age of her mother, she answered, "Well, I'll tell you, Mrs. 23 years ago in Maryland, I paid a lawyer $5 to look up the will of my mother's first master. He looked back 60 years and said it was time to give up. I told him to go back further. He went back 65 years. When there he found the will, giving the girl Rita to his granddaughter, Mary Patterson, to serve her and her offspring till she was 45 years of age. This granddaughter died soon after, unmarried, and as there was no provision for Rita, in case of her death, she was actually emancipated at that time. But no one informed her of the fact, and she and her dear children remained in bondage till emancipated by the courage and determination of this heroic daughter and sister. The old woman must then, it seems, be 98 years of age, and the old man has probably numbered as many years. And yet these old people, living out beyond the toll gate on the South Street Road, Auburn, come in every Sunday more than a mile to the Central Church. To be sure, deep slumbers settle down upon them as soon as they are seated, which continue undisturbed till the congregation is dismissed. But they have done their best, and who can doubt that they receive a blessing? Immediately after this they go to class meeting at the Methodist Church. Then they wait for a third service, and after that start out home again. On asking Harriet where they got anything to eat on Sunday, she said in her quiet way, "Oh, these old folks nibbler eats anything on Sunday, missy. We nibblers have no food to get for dem on Sunday. Des always fast, and des nibblers eats anything on Fridays. Good Friday and 5 Fridays hang Gwen from Good Friday. My fitter nibbers eats or drinks all day, fasting 45 bleeding wounds of Jesus. All the other Fridays of the year we neighbors eat till the sun goes down. Then he takes a little tea and a piece of the bread." "But is he a Roman Catholic, Harriet?" "Oh, no, missy. He does it for conscience. He was taught to do so down south. He says if he denies himself for the suffering of his Lord and Master, Jesus will sustain him." It had been mentioned that Harriet never asked anything for herself, but whenever her people were in trouble, or she felt impelled to go south to guide to freedom friend or brother or father and mother, if she had not time to work for the money, she was persistent till she got it from somebody. When she received one of her intimations that the old people were in trouble, and it was time for her to go to them, she asked the Lord where she should go for the money. She was in some way, as what she supposed, directed to the office of a certain gentleman in New York. When she left the house of her friends to go there, she said, "I'm going to Mister's office, and I ain't going to leave there, and I ain't going to eat or drink till I get enough money to take me down after your old people." She went to the gentleman's office. "What do you want, Harriet?" was the first greeting. "I want some money, sir." "You do? How much do you want?" "I want $20, sir." $20? Who told you to come here for $20? "The Lord told me, sir." "Well, I guess the Lord's mistaken this time." "I guess he isn't, sir. Anyhow, I'm going to sit here till I get it." So she sat down and went to sleep. All the morning and all the afternoon she sat there still sleeping and rousing up, sometimes finding the office full of gentlemen, sometimes finding herself alone. Many fugitives were passing through New York at that time, and those who came in supposed that she was one of them, tired out and resting. Sometimes she would be roused up with the words, "Come, Harriet, you had better go. There's no money for you here." "No, sir, I'm not going till I get my $20. She does not know all that happened, for deep sleep fell upon her. But probably her story was whispered about, and she roused at last to find herself the happy possessor of $60, which had been raised among those who came into the office. She went on her way rejoicing to bring her old parents from the land of bondage. She found that her father was to be tried the next Monday for helping off slaves, so as she says, she removed his trial to a higher court and hurried him off to Canada. One more little incident, which it is hoped may not be offensive to the young lady to whom it alludes, may be mentioned here, showing Harriet's extreme delicacy in asking anything for herself. Last winter, 67 or 68, as we all know, the snow was very deep for months, and Harriet and the old people were completely snowed in their little home. The old man was laid up with rheumatism, and Harriet could not leave home for a long time to procure supplies of corn, if she could have made her way into the city. At length, stern necessity compelled her to plunge through the drifts to the city, and she appeared at the house of one of her firm and fast friends, and was directed to the room of one of the young ladies. She began to walk up and down as she always does when in trouble. At length she said, "Miss Annie." "What, Harriet?" A long pause, then again, "Miss Annie." "Well, what is it, Harriet?" This was repeated 4 times, when the young lady, looking up, saw her eyes filled with tears. She then insisted on knowing what she wanted, and with a great effort she said, "Miss Annie, could you lend me a quarter till Monday? I never asked it before." Kind friends immediately supplied all the wants of the family, but on Monday Harriet appeared with the quarter she had borrowed. But though so timid for herself, she is bold enough when the wants of her race are concerned. Even now, while friends are trying to raise the means to publish this little book for her, she is going around with the greatest zeal and interest to raise a subscription for her Freedmen's Fair. She called on Honorable William H. Stewart the other day for a subscription to this object. He said, "Harriet, you have worked for others long enough. It is time you should think of yourself. If you ask for a donation for yourself, I will give it to you, but I will not help you to rob yourself for others." Harriet's charity for all the human race is unbounded. It embraces even the slaveholders. It sympathizes even with Jeff Davison, and rejoices at his departure to other lands with some prospect of peace for the future. She says, "I think there's many slaveholders get to heaven. They don't know no better. They acts up to the light they have. You take this sweet little child," pointing to a lonely baby, "appears more like an angel than anything else. Take her down there and let her neighbor know nothing about niggers, but they was made to be whipped, and she'd grow up to use the whip on 'em just like the rest. No, missus, it's because they don't know better. May God give the people to whom the story of this woman shall come a little charity, so that through their kindness the last days of her stormy and troubled life may be calm and peaceful." End of the appendix.